Assalamu alaikum, friends of BookBytes. Once again, I have the opportunity tonight to showcase something that the Okaf Legacy Project has really, I think, outdone themselves. A few weeks ago, we spoke to Sheikh Shafiq Morton about Circle of the Saints, and this weekend we've got a review copy of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam at 1500, his prophetic legacy, ethical vision, and contemporary resonance. What the 1500 Legacy Project with Okaf has done is they've really set the bar high in creating and marking 1500 years since the birth of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by reflecting on his enduring ethical legacy and its contemporary resonance, bringing together a range of public intellectuals and scholars in a combination, an anthology of essays edited by Professor Aslam Fataar, who will be joining us this evening on Book Bites. And I just quickly want to say that I think a book of this nature, an anthology of this nature, is so incredibly, firstly, beautifully written, thoughtfully focused, but it is a collection that you want on your bookshelf, whether you are a person, an adherent of the Muslim faith, or a scholar of anthology, history, comparative religious studies. And I think that what this book does is it puts and it brings the legacy of the prophetic traditions, written and spoken, to the contemporary public domain, and allows us to understand various aspects through the writings of these scholars and these commentators. And it also allows us to interrogate what the prophetic traditions means in our own lives. So we'll be joined in a few seconds by Professor Fatah and also by Professor Tahir Satoto, who's based at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He's currently in the Eastern Cape. We'll have him online on the phone. Professor Fataar is a research professor at the University of Stellenbosch. He's done numerous work engaging in social inquiry, pedagogy, moral formation, and public responsibility in deeply unequal societies. Assalamu alaikum, Professor Fataar. Welcome to Book Bites. It's an absolute privilege to have the opportunity to chat to you this evening.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sister Shafinaaz. It is a real honor and a privilege for me to be speaking to you this evening, inshallah.
Mubarak on a beautiful compilation to both the Okaf Legacy Project and to you in particular. I think this must have been, a project of personal and professional relevance in so many ways. So let's go back quickly and speak to us about how this project came about and your vision for bringing it to this beautiful finality.
Shukran. So about, let's say, 15 months ago, um, in the context of the Prophetic Legacy Commission, who really has put together an exceptionally important and engaging set of programs to commemorate the 1500 lunar year birth of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And they have had a number of engaging opportunities to profile that particular legacy and ask what it means for us today. Essay competitions, speech making competitions, writing of a text on the Prophet and utilizing some of the Prophet's ahadith, etc., etc. One of the hinge projects turned out to be this book, but it didn't have an easy career over the last 15 years because we needed really to persuade ourselves and to partner with OCAF South Africa and their Legacies project. But we had to persuade ourselves that we are going to engage in a process that will produce a very meaningful output. And we were kind of nervous, right? Because who are we to write about the Prophet? And I say that in strongly devotional terms. But when it came to the decision, there was no turning back. We put in process to a 12-month period in which we started at the very basics. And I wrote a fairly extensive brief about what the book should entail. And then I invited about 35 people, academics, public intellectuals, and so on, to write abstracts to me within the particular themes that I was suggesting. And we had to have a common purpose. And the common purpose was to communicate and make an argument about the Prophet legacy from the perspective of South Africans to the world, right? So we were, in a sense, saying that we're living the prophetic legacy. We are going to try and understand what that means for us from Cape Town and South Africa and Joburg and Durban and so on, and KwaZulu and the Eastern Cape and Soweto, and how that, in a sense, traveled back into the world. And we were trying then to, in a sense, engage the normal encounter where this kind of work comes from the majority world down to us. We were suggesting that we needed to move it further up. We identified a couple of themes, we identified a number of chapter authors, and then we started writing. And the writing took place over about 9, 10 months of kind of very interesting, beautiful, arduous, engaging editorially and otherwise processes that produced this book, Alhamdulillah.
I mean, I look at the wide themes that are covered here, and look, we must appreciate that in South Africa, we can draw on such a wide range of strong scholarship, and you've
Yeah,
definitely captured it in this collection. We've got Shafiq Morton, Suleiman Dango, Rosida Shabuddin. We'll have Prof. Tahir later on. We've got Ibrahim Musa, Quresha, Suleiman. I mean, there's just such a rich wealth of connectivity in this collection. And as you've said, not only have the themes been engaged, but you've brought it to the contemporary, the personal and political of our South African experience. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the particularities of the South African experience, trying to make meaning in, as your essay says, a world on fire,
yeah,
um, from within the moral basis and the resource of the Hadith traditions.
mashallah. So at least three things we were trying to keep in view. Firstly, and most importantly, I think, was to keep the Prophet's legacy in view at the moment of its birth, 7th century Arabia, and all that made up the Risala of the Prophet and the Nubuwwah of the Prophet, and to work with the source materials that came out of that, and to be completely true to that moment. Right? We couldn't, of course, obviously, write about the Prophet and skip over or undermine that particular moment. All of us lived in fidelity and in faithfulness to that particular, almost in devotional terms, right? And that's how we encounter the Prophet. And then we had to say, right, so how did this, a very interesting concept emerge, how did this legacy in its depth of integrity in that founding moment travel across time, travel across space, and landed in the various spaces in the world and in South Africa when it did? And what was the legacy that was established out of that, almost that traveling metaphor? So on the one hand, we had to have to have a depth of integrity about the prophetic moment itself, and we really persuaded about importance. But then we also need to understand how the prophetic legacy, because of its dynamism and because of its non-static nature, entered into particular environments across time, and to have an acute understanding of the prophetic legacy across time. And so, while not all of us are experts about the prophetic legacy and how it unfolded across, that was the sensibility that we had to infuse in our writing. And then the third issue was to apply it to contemporary times. And for contemporary times, the answer that we gave to ourselves was that we live in South Africa, and the contemporary moment that we're living in is fundamentally infused by the context of the South African Cape Town, Joburg, KwaZulu, Soweto, Durban space that we're in, and how communities, how people, how intellectuals and scholars have localized and given expression to the prophetic legacy in the African times. In that sense, laid a basis, three pillars, and then we ask the question: so how do we mobilize those three moments and speak it back into the world so that we can make a contribution from here? And from that emerged these four or five, I would say, six themes, or four themes as stated in the book, but there are two other themes: the question of gender and the question of ihsan, beauty. It's kind of the underpinning that came out almost serendipitously in the book. So when the chapter started coming in, we had a careful sense about how the book would be constituted, but we were thoroughly surprised in the very fact of its makeup and its constitution when it did happen. We planned for it, we wrote for it, we edited for it, but the way it landed was absolutely beautiful. From the prophet's persona and his personification of his life, within the embodiment thereof, within the time. and chapters on that. Then chapters on institution building, about how the prophetic legacy informed the building of institutions such as Waqf and economy and business and media and so on. And then we also suggested that there's a moment in time where you have to confront the decolonial world that you're in, that you have to kind of resist. But what is the nature of the world to build out of that resistance? So it is the question of race, and how Sheikh Tahir confronted the question of race at the very heart of the problematization of Islam over time, and how he writes about it. And then Sheikh Dr. Rashid Umar speaks about the first migration moment, the moment of moving to Habasha in about 1613, 1614. What does that hold up for us? The development of Sufism out of the cradle of Islam in the founding moment, and so on. And then finally, of course, the educational, the pedagogical, the scientific, the calligraphy moments. And those were the themes. But underpinning all of this, we ought also seen, because we have six very powerfully chapters written by women, the gender dimension flows through it seamlessly and beautifully, and as well as the culmination, kind of organizing logic of the book eventually is the question of ihsan, the question of beauty as a kind of a virtue that underpins the prophetic legacy and enters into societies in relation to the lives that people live.
I'm going to come back to an earlier question I have about discourse and interpretation, but you ended on Ihsan, which is the basis for your essay. Expand for us this concept of Ihsan in a changing world, and how we try to understand our own sort of contributions to the world as Muslims, not just to the world, South Africa in particular, and the world at large.
Subhanallah al-Azim. Um, Firstly, I was blessed. I was also helped by my wife Najwa, who continuously held the project for me together, as well as my friend and editorial assistant Mujahid, Dr. Mujahid Osman, a young man, beautiful scholar. But I wrote the final chapter, and I did not succeed in in my final chapter in sort of consolidating the book. That I did not do that. But what I did was to kind of pick out the core ethical frame that for me emerged through the book, and that is an ethics of ihsan. And I wanted to write about an ethics of ihsan in a way that speaks to the complex livelihoods that we live now, where we are confronted by all of these complex challenges. I call it a world on fire. Why a world on fire? It's evocative, it's a bit dramatic, but we wrote this book in the context of genocide. And so the one lesson that we had to teach ourselves is that we have to give effect to the impulses that we're a part of and we're experiencing. So it is three things or four things. So it is genocide and war on the African continent and in the Middle East and in Palestine and in Gaza and now in Iran. It is the question of artificial intelligence that's rewiring our sense of humanness at the very moment at which we're trying to uncover what it means to be human. Artificial intelligence is kind of interrupting older notions of how we uncover, recover, and reanimate our humanness in this world. And thirdly, creeping trauma and poverty and oppression in our communities that is unfolding in these very complex new ways. And so that was what I used the notion of a world on fire. But my question is, how do you use the prophetic legacy? You apply it from its original moment. You understand how it travels, because I also refer to some of the founding fathers in Cape Town, like Sufi Sahib and Sheikh Yusuf and Tuan Guru and so on, because they were the repositories, the carriers of it. But now, how do you carry us forward into this particular moment so that it helps, one, to address the complexities associated with a world on fire that we're living in, develops a bulwark, tells us that we have an ethics, an adab, an akhlaq, an ethics of ihsan that allows us to confront these things with beauty, with resistance, and with a full multidimensional experience. We are not cowed by the moment and the intentions of those who transact the moment onto the world and so on. We're not cowed by that. We have a legacy that speaks back. And I was careful to argue that the prophetic legacy is able, when we think about it and do it and persuade each other through dialogue and conversation and our education process, that can interrupt trauma, that can interrupt the effects of resistance. And we have to look throughout the legacy for it, but we have this resource of interruption. And we take it right back to the stories of that gets told in the Quran. In this beautiful way that we mobilize it, we take it into the moments in which memory and story and small acts of mercy and forgiveness and generosity amongst our communities, our women and so on, at various points in our existence have contributed to this interruption. And it's for me a key thing because trauma, if you don't interrupt, there's always repeating itself. So the prophetic legacy is put to work, and the ethics of ihsan is pedagogically put to work. You can teach it in order to interrupt this trauma. And that is basically the argument that I was making in my particular chapter.
I really appreciated, from a sort of I don't want to oversimplify the premise of your work, but just to say that the idea that if you put a vortex of ihsan out into the world, you bring some of that back into your own life, into your own community.
Allah
And
Akbar.
and I wanted to bring back to the question I had earlier that we look at the prophetic traditions as a resource for our moral basis, for moral clarity, but also as a kind of discursive language, a discursive practice. Islam and certainly not the Hadith are not seen as monolithic. And so even our interpretations from South Africa have various expressions. And this comes through in many of the interpretive essays in this collection. Let's talk about some of that. I don't know if my
Yeah,
question is clear. Just
yeah,
this
yes.
concept of interpretation from different parts of South Africa and how we've brought this together as legacy and what that means and what is seen like as we project it out into the world and make our contribution to it.
I think that is a beautiful question in the way you frame it. Islam is a discursive interpretive tradition, and how does that give an expression in the book? In the first instance, the answer that I want to give, and I'll come back to the discursive in a minute, is the multi to highlight the multi-dimensional nature of the prophetic legacy. It is not simply education or simply ethics and so on in the abstract of actual lives. What I mean by multidimensional, so if you go through the book, it's focusing on endowments and the centrality of that beautiful chapter by brothers Zainul Abidin Kaji. Then there's focus on corporate ethics. How do you behave when you live in the corporate world, and that is where you make your business and so on and so forth by Qureisha Suleiman. And then there's, for example, a chapter on media and why it is that the media needs to find its voice in order to expose the brutality and to develop alternatives and put it into the public domain as an amana that we may be struggling with to. So the author there is Mahmoud Sangli, and his bugbear to me is that we're not doing this enough. We're not puncturing the discourse. That's your point, right? So we're not puncturing the discourse, the dominant discourse that's out there. So those are just some of the examples. A couple of other examples, beautiful examples of my PhD student Widad Surkoti writing about calligraphy and calligraphy education taken online. It's almost an oxymoron because calligraphy education you must do with your master in front of him, where you can basically touch your hand and touch and engage your persona in order for you to develop a calligraphy hand, as it were. And Fadil Esop, he writes about science and how he was positioned relative to to the scientific method and almost alienating him from his religious and scientific orientation that comes from the Islamic legacy itself, and how he had to discover that and become the scientist that he become a moral and ethical scientist. So in the first instance, answer to your question is Islam has a multi-dimensional answer to the prophetic legacy to be made. Now, secondly, it is to enter into the world of discourse and into the world of interpretation. And here the question becomes that we don't want to make major arguments about how you have to reread the text or the read it. No, what we are saying is that we have to apply these questions about reorientation and reimagining and rethinking to very real life challenges. Let me give you one. When Muslim women are by virtue of discourse and by virtue of spatial organization marginalized in the spaces of worshipping, then write about it, then mobilize the prophetic discourse and put the two together. This exclusionary nature of excluding vulnerable people and women and people who don't matter, non-elites, from the spaces of worship and so on. But then go back to the prophetic legacy and see what the prophet really said about the organization of space, so that we include women, we include those who are vulnerable into the center of our existence. Remember, the prophet's first followers were all vulnerable people, men, women, and children, orphans, and vulnerable people. And Islam indeed made physical and mental space for all of them. So the discourse needed to change. There's another one or two other examples that I can explain about. Let's speak about, for example, Sheikh Tawar Sitoto's beautiful chapter. I want him to speak about it, but let me just give you a one-liner on it. His argument is that the Muslim discourse, you've mentioned it, over time, has not properly, at the very founding moment until to now, dealt with the question of race and slavery. Subhanallah al right? So he asks us to confront a fault line in our community. If we really, why does he do that? He does it and takes us through a text by a West African scholar that helps us understand that. A rereading of a purported hadith. The purported hadith says, educate the Muslim, but actually, if you read the Arabic properly as he did, it means emulate. Sorry, the purported hadith means educate or lead the so-called blacks, because they have these luminaries in their midst, like Bilal and the king of Habasha. But when you actually reread this purported hadith properly, then you will see it is take your lead from or emulate the blacks. That is what ittahadu means in Sheikh Tahir Sitawto's Watson. What is Sheikh Tahir doing there? He's trying to challenge the discourse and changing it, but he's putting his finger on a fault line in the Muslim community currently, which is racism, sexism, exclusion, and the use of our religious discourses to justify it. He takes us to the founding moment to unravel that. That is and it's a practical problem. And that is how the book deals with question of context, question of challenge, and then speaking directly into how we ought to live right now. This is the gift of the book.
We're seeing numerous examples at the moment of Islamophobia, both on our east and west coasts. Sometimes as a pushback to our stand against genocide happening in Gaza, and we're seeing, in a more sort of right thinking world, or in a Trump led world. I think a lot more sort of audacity to speak in racist terms, and Muslims are often taking the brunt of that. Let's speak to the um, how the Hadith provides us with an opportunity to push back against that, but also to speak to some of the Afrophobia we're seeing in our mosques and in our public spaces.
So, if you once again take some of the chapters of the book, we are arguing that we have to do two things at the same time. We have to push back against the worst discursive excesses of Islamophobia all over the world. It's just horrendous how Muslims are being branded and how Muslims are at the receiving end of more and more vicious, somewhat sophisticated, and at other times not sophisticated. I'm watching the British space, for example, and how the rise of Islamophobia in Britain is currently working and how people are really suffering, but they're also pushing back. So the book is an attempt to provide a kind of a confidence to Muslims to say, look, there's no way that, at least discursively and in terms of your Islamic religion, can stand back. You are the inheritors of a proud, proud, proud tradition. And inside of this tradition, across its 1500 years, there are numerous examples that you can draw on in order to strengthen your feet in the world that we're living in. We ha- and we have to kind of share that an inheritance to every single one in this in South Africa and in the world. So in Cape Town last week we had a launch But we decided to have a launch to invite people from other faith communities, leaders and professors from other faith communities, to interact with the book and to have a conversation about how ethical and faith traditions in the plural, including Islam, from the perspective of this book, can come together and can be and can mobilize a world of solidarity that pushes back against Islamophobia. So that's the first, and the conversations were beautiful. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we also need at the very same time to be critical of the house inside of Islam, and the house inside of Islam um, mobilize fragments and misreadings of the tradition in order to connect with the right wing cause. Now, how ridiculous is that? They will never recognize themselves as being feeders of Islamophobia, sowing division, using madhab and tradition to sow division amongst ourselves, and then practicing that, which then gets picked up by the Islamophobes and move back against us. What we're saying is that we have to kind of have a conversation, a complicated conversation about where the fault lines are in our community. And we have to develop a social cohesion discourse that brings people out of those margins of irrational thinking into the margin of thinking the prophet into a beautiful thinking the prophet's legacy back into a beautiful situation. And that is the conversation we're inviting. It's just a dual conversation. It is the pushback against Islamophobia, but it's also the pushback against the irrational thought in our community that prevents us from developing cohesion in relation to the challenge of Islamophobia.
Prof, I'm really grateful that you bring up, very graciously the fault lines, because in a relatively small Muslim community as South Africa is, I think we sometimes have the most sort of conservative knee jerk reactions to each other. And there's this othering within our community instead of really taking on this concept of what being an ummah is all about.
Yes.
And we find that in our masajid, we find that in our regular sort of spaces, and in the online spaces as well,
Mhm.
um, as a way to transfer legacy to the next generation. How do we overcome these kind of this hold on to I know better when it
Right.
comes to issues of religious sort of superiority that seem to be not specifically just about ulama, but across the board, just holding on to ideas of not allowing for continuous discourse.
So that is a very, you probably know that that's a very complicated question, but I'm going to try to answer it and then you can kind of come back. Look, we are living in an age of, let me use a metaphor, the horizontalization of knowledge is now on the table. Knowledge acquisition is not a vertical process of deep reading and deep study only anymore. That's still, people are still doing that. Like I'm a
Mm.
professor of education policy studies, so I've got to know the literature deeply. But my students, they can access the same knowledge horizontally through the social media, through artificial intelligence, and through Google search and that kind of a thing. And but they wouldn't have acquired it in the depth that I may have acquired it because I come from a different generation, Generation X, where we actually had to read text deeply, and then we actually had to do hard work in trying to assimilating it into our intellectual apparatus, right? Today, you can skip that, and you can access knowledge. This is what I call horizontally. You don't actually have to go through the vertical acquisition processes of learning. So that's on the table. How do you deal with that? Right? So this is where the noise comes from, essentially. 15, 20, 30 years ago, the noise came from different traditions of people who had equally deep readings of the text and of the Islamic discourse, and they had they had they had epistemological fault lines, the rationalists versus the ethicists versus the mystics versus the Sharia versus the Kalam people. And they had all of them had equally deep readings because they had studied it, and then the arguments would have been out of that vertical arguments across the ordinary people wasn't part of that. Today, that's all collapsed. So now we're sitting with, if I may use a biblical metaphor, a Tower of Babel. And that refers to a lack of a language, lack of a coherence. Now, when you are in this particular space, you are really staring down a barrel because Everyone has an opinion about something. And now, so how do you develop a kind of a coherence? I think we have to acknowledge that, firstly. Secondly, we can't condemn it because it's the zeitgeist all the time. People who condemn it are kind of missing the point, because the more you condemn, the more you're chasing someone down a rabbit hole, and out of which they'll never come, they'll never listen to you, right? So listening is also a problem. That is why in my chapter I say that the Quran makes a demand on the person who will listen, the person who hears, but the person who can listen with a heart, right? The person for whom listening and hearing, this beautiful, this demarcation between sam'a, which is listening, or hearing, and istami', which is listening, and how that penetrates the heart. With the Quran says, فَهُوَ قَلْبُ sam'a wa huwa shahid, that you have to listen with a conscious mind and a spiritual heart. And so how do you cultivate that? That is the moment that we're in. So we have to be deeply tolerant of the fragmented knowledge that's staring us out in the face. It is a bugbear frustration of mine, but you cannot go into the space of condemnation, because then you condemn everyone to thy kingdom. Come, to use a Christian metaphor here again, right? Everyone will be gone. So now you've got to learn to be open to the diversity and the heterogeneity of opinion, heterodoxity of opinion, and so on. And then you've got to call in a conversation. And this is what this book is trying to do. This book is trying to say, this is a book that establishes a conversation for which you need patient reading. If you have a difference of opinion, please read my argument first and make your argument equally compelling, so that I can also hear from it. And we must be able to say what are better arguments and what are less better arguments. We've got to develop that sensibility in the community. But our first port of call is every argument, good or bad or ugly, is on the table. Cannot wipe it off the table. And we've got to insist that the better argument must always be given a chance to persuade you. And that is to develop an ethics of persuasion, an ethic of it. So if people are going to make each other kafir, takfir, and so on and so forth, then we have no chance of speaking to the complexity in which we live our lives at the moment.
And there would be a sure sort of, I suppose, a waste and a sadness in terms of how we want to engage and, the prophetic traditions. I think this book, in many ways, is an invitation to surrender to the idea that you could read and assimilate someone's point of view, and then, like you say, add to the discourse in your own way.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
certainly hope that readers will be receptive to the messages, will be receptive to the idea of conjecture, will be receptive to the idea of learning through a collection of this nature. And I actually now wonder if you will have further volumes,
yeah.
coming out of conversations from this book. Can we hope to see further volumes in the future?
So this is the way I'm currently, and a couple of us are currently thinking about taking this project forward. We have had a lot of criticism from a generational perspective, if you know what I mean, the age perspective, that a text like this is really a generation gone by's endeavor. How do you speak the same substance in different modes? Right now, that's a very dangerous, that's for me a very interesting question, because it's about curation. This is the new word that I've come to discover young people use. You've got to curate the prophetic legacy. So someone came to me and said, please take what you said in the text and curate it to the younger generation. So, okay, that's a very complicated conversation, because what he thinks, what I think he means is we have to make podcasts of it, we have to make Twitter posts, we have to make Facebook what's and so on and so forth. Okay, in that space, and now you've got to dumb down your own what's but perhaps we could do that, right? But what I would want to engage in is to bring the next level, young, and yes, it's a bit of an ageist comment, the younger set generation into a conversation like this, and animate that conversation with a depth of discursive experience. In other words, if I have 60 people from South Africa or from Cape Town or from Durban, and we bring them around a kind of a table, we are now going to curate the conversation. We bring them from those who research artificial intelligence, to those who do research in the latest version, latest biomedical therapies, to those who are doing work in satellite science, to those who are doing work, etc. areas that we couldn't have imagined when we were teaching. They are all doing stellar secular work in those areas. Ask them to have a conversation with the curation of the prophetic legacy in that and see what comes from that, and then to generate a set of questions that the younger set from whence they speak could begin to answer that question. And the second question is to talk about what is the mode of delivery. So it may indeed be a book. That's what I prefer. But it may indeed be a number of other modalities. It may be art, it may be science, it may be the utilization of different communication skills and so on. But at the center of it all is is the is the is the mobilization of intellectual work to develop the form that gives credence to that intellectual work, and to develop the communicative modalities, in other words, how we're going to communicate it, to let it land in the generations that's following us. So that is much, much more difficult than this very difficult process. It was indeed a difficult process of us 23 people writing the book and me editing the book and so on. But there's a more difficult process that awaits us. And it's the one that I just explained to you. It's the curation of the prophetic legacy that's on the table now.
I'm very excited about the prospect and the potential for what you're suggesting, because if younger people are allowed to take ownership in a way, of what they would take from the hadith, by saying this is how it fits into their life, this is their interpretation of it, and if they were able to express it through reels, uh, TikToks, arts, and the like, I think there would be a different kind of assimilation and
Mm.
understanding, and take, like I said, taking ownership of interpreting hadith to a way that makes sense and makes meaning for them. So there's beautiful potential, a lot of work out there. But
Yes.
Jazakallah khair for the work that you do, to sort of re-engage this conversation around how hadith legacy can be interpreted for us, for our generations, for future generations, and how that makes sense to us living in the contemporary society that we live in, this dynamic and ever-changing society that we live in, and how we project that out into the world.
Shukran Jazakumullah for this very generous conversation. Um, MashaAllah, it's also now triggered a number of questions in my head, which is a good thing, which means it was a good conversation. And I really appreciate sharing the time with you this evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam. So we had an opportunity to speak to Professor Aslam Fataar. Unfortunately, we were not able to reach Professor Tyre Satoto, and we had this incredibly robust conversation around the anthology Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam at 1500. This is a book that will continue conversations through its launches with OCAF around the country. Please do get yourself a copy. Please engage the text, the incredibly profound scholarship revealed here, and contribute to the conversation in any which way you can. That's it from us on Book Bites this evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.